Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and in this video I want to talk to you about the idea of processed and ultra-processed foods. The majority of people who are struggling with out-of-control eating tend to be more drawn to these types of foods. And there's so much out there at the moment about processed foods, they're addictive, they're really bad for us. And so when we're being bombarded with these messages, how do we reconcile that with the idea of food neutrality and having permission to eat what we want? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. So just to briefly define what processed and ultra-processed foods are. Processed foods are foods that contain ingredients that have gone through some kind of processing. The most common ones that we might think of is foods that contain flour and sugar. Ultra-processed foods are foods that contain what they call industrial ingredients. So these are the kind of ingredients that you don't find in the kitchen or on the supermarket shelves. So they are things like preservatives, emulsifiers, sweeteners, artificial colours and flavourings, that type of thing. And many of these types of foods have been very carefully designed by the manufacturers to hit what they call a bliss point, which is that perfect mix of sweet and salty, that taste that just it tastes good and we want to eat more of it. Their goal is to make us eat more. So the food is designed in a way to encourage us to do that. Now, if you struggle with food, that in and of itself can become a bit of a battle. You might have heard that certain foods, particularly foods that are high in sugar, when you eat them, that the reward pathways in the brain light up, and when they look at it in an MRI scanner, it looks similar to how the brain lights up when someone's just taken cocaine. So there's a lot of talk about sugar acts on the brain like cocaine does. Well, one of the common rebuttals that I hear to that is that if you scan the brain of a mother holding her child, the same reward pathways light up in the brain. In life, we are human beings that are driven by reward. We seek out reward. So therefore, this reward pathway that we have in our brain is a big part of what motivates us, what drives our behavior. Maybe one of the tasks of being a human being on this planet is to figure out how to manage these pathways. Now, the word addiction isn't even used in clinical diagnosis anymore because it's so hard to actually diagnose addiction. So when I'm thinking about that word, I really like Gabor Mate's explanation. And he says, I'm going to have to read it because I won't remember it. He says, an addiction manifests in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in and therefore craves, suffers negative consequences from, and has trouble giving up. So it's a behavior that someone finds temporary relief or pleasure, that you crave it, that it's hard to give it up, and that there's some negative consequences. That can apply to anything. So whilst I don't think the term food addiction is helpful for anybody who struggles with disordered eating, these addictive processes play out in all areas of our life. So it is going to play out with food as well to some degree. But the trouble is, when you take a very black and white view to that, you think, well then, if I'm addicted to these foods and these foods are the problem, then abstinence seems to be the only solution. You try to cut out these foods, which has the added benefit of hopefully losing weight, which most of you want to do as well. But now it's set you up in the restrict cycle. So now you're binging because you're restricting. This is why nuance is so important. There is this idea that is often touted in the anti-diet world and sometimes in the way people talk about intuitive eating. And it's this: if you give yourself permission to eat what you want, you will eventually start to crave the types of foods that your body needs. So this being like, have unconditional permission to eat all the processed and ultra-processed foods you want, because your body, your brain will regulate once you let go of the emotional tussle with these foods. This works really well for some people, and for some people it doesn't. And these are the people who are left feeling gaslighted by the anti-diet message. Now let me say, I believe in permission. I think that recovery involves making peace with these types of foods. I would first of all invite you to consider, is your desire for these foods just about the pull that these foods have? And what I would want you to consider before you answer that is, when you have these foods, is it about wanting that food or is it about wanting a certain experience? So again, there's always exceptions, But the majority of people, when they binge or they go into a compulsive eating episode, they are on their phone, they're watching TV, they're scrolling on the internet, they're driving, they're doing something else. So there's this kind of splitting of attention that happens with the soothing of the food and what's going on in the brain as a result of eating the food. And it creates this rather, at the time, it can feel quite pleasant, this sort of numbed out state. If you're somebody who's very self-critical and you've got a lot of shoulds in your head, it can sometimes feel like eating is the way that you just get a moment's respite from all of that noise. If you resonate with this, then in order to change your relationship with that type of food, those activities, you might benefit from trying to separate them for a while. I've shared this many times before. One of the things I did for 2 months, I ate whatever I wanted to eat, no holds barred. The only condition was I had to sit at the table and really pay attention and try to enjoy what I was eating. And it was hard. It was hard. One of the arguments as well for why these foods could be addictive is when you stop eating them, you go through similar symptoms like a withdrawal. Well, I can tell you, I was still eating these foods and sitting at the table, and I had those feelings like a withdrawal, because what I wanted was to flop down on the sofa and turn that telly on and just switch off from life for a bit. I had to break that association between television watching and those foods. I didn't have to do it forever, but I did need to do it for a while. When me or anyone else, we're talking about riding out binge urges, sometimes the binge urge is an urge to binge, and sometimes it's just a craving for one of these foods. But these foods are always associated with binging. So when you feel a strong craving for a processed or ultra-processed food, you are anticipating a binge. The only way you really allow yourself to have these foods is if you go unconscious at the same time. So that requires eating a lot of those foods to get yourself into that state. So making peace with these foods also involves learning how to ride out your cravings. I can give you a recent example of this. A couple of weekends ago, I went to stay with a friend. It was her birthday. I stayed with her all weekend. And over that weekend, we ate a lot of what would come under the category of processed and ultra-processed foods. I came back on Sunday night, and on Monday, didn't really have much in, hadn't planned very well. But also I found that any time I was thinking of foods that were not ultra-processed foods, I didn't really want them. I found my cravings were still for that taste, for that stimulation. And so on the Monday, I ended up eating again more processed and ultra-processed foods. And it got to the end of Monday, and there's no guilt for me anymore around these foods. And that's one of the most liberating things, is when you don't feel guilty about it, you can really look and go, what is actually going on here? What is it that I need? And so I thought, by the end of Monday, I feel like I'm in this craving cycle with these types of foods. So what I need to do is tomorrow, I'm planning my meals, and I'm going to have foods that I enjoy, but also foods that are higher up on the nutritional value scale. Again, it's quite hard to talk about these foods without the language making it sound like it's not a neutral thing. And so I planned in food, meals with vegetables and with fruits. But I didn't say to myself, I need to try not to eat ultra-processed foods tomorrow. I was like, no, I'm going to eat these meals, and if I still want something that's sweet or processed, that is still an option. But I'm going to make sure that I eat my meals first. The intuitive eating principle that's probably spoken about the least is the gentle nutrition part. So I always see the gentle nutrition as adding things in. The way my blood sugar is going to respond if I eat some sweet processed food on its own compared to if I eat it after I've just had a meal. If you have protein, fats and fibre in your belly and you eat certain foods, it is going to affect your biology differently than if you eat it on an empty stomach. We can use this kind of information really gently to try to help balance ourselves out around these foods. Because when your blood sugar is going up and down, when your blood sugar falls, that's when the cravings hit again. So the cycle that I was in may have been partly to do with blood sugar. But if I'd carried on just having these cravings and going, I'm craving these foods, so I must want it, and keep reaching for it, I don't know that I naturally get to a place where I'm like, no, I don't want those foods anymore. I don't think that's me. I know some people do. And if that works for you, brilliant, go with that, try it out. But if it doesn't work, I don't want you to feel like you're failing at this permission thing, because that's how some people are feeling. So this is very much about food peace. We want to reduce the conflict around these kinds of foods. We can acknowledge that they don't have the same impact on us, but I wholeheartedly, from a moral and emotional perspective, believe in food neutrality, that all foods fit. It doesn't mean that all foods are the same, but it doesn't mean that you are good or bad for whether you consume them or not. And the minute you start attributing that moral value, you get yourself in a conflict, and now the higher thinking part of you that can manage the more primal reward pathways goes offline in a state of stress. These foods can be very enjoyable. They can be an enhancing part of life when we have a better relationship with them. We can keep them in their place where it's an enhancement, not where it's a behavior that feels compulsive and leads to more pain. If you're somebody who feels like you really struggle to say no to these types of foods, you might want to check out this video here. I think it might be helpful as well. But thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.